to hear your voice and to follow where you lead. Amen. So I realized in reading the story from John's Gospel over the past few days that the Easter stories we've been hearing over these past number of weeks have had a theme that I have never realized before. They're all about engaging our various senses. I have no idea if this was intentional plan set out by the folks who did our lectionary, but there you have it. First, it was touch. In the days after Jesus' death and resurrection, he returns to an upper room with his disciples, but Thomas, not being present for Jesus' first appearance to them, says he can't accept it until he can touch Jesus and touch his wounds. Then it was sight and taste on the road to Emmaus. The disciples on the road to Emmaus don't recognize Jesus. They can't see him. They can't recognize him until he breaks bread with them, seeing and tasting. This week, it's about hearing. In our story from John's Gospel this morning, Jesus tells his followers a story about shepherds and their sheep. And in this metaphor, he emphasizes the point that sheep know the voice of their shepherd. They recognize it over the voices of all the other shepherds. They know it, and they follow the voice of their shepherd. And this, of course, makes sense. And it certainly would have made sense to our first century sisters and brothers. They knew something about shepherds. Perhaps even some of those listening to him were actually shepherds. And the metaphor of God or of Jesus as a shepherd is a common one used throughout our Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And it's a comforting image for many, as we heard reflected in our reading of the 23rd Psalm. And we've probably all seen at some point or another a painting or a sculpture or some other artistic rendering of Jesus as a shepherd. It's on the cover of our bulletin today. Jesus tending his flock, Jesus carrying a sheep on his shoulders. And there's a beauty and a tenderness in these images, reflecting the bond between a shepherd and his sheep, between God and God's people. And in our reading today, Jesus is emphasizing the depth and the intimacy of this relationship. The sheep hear his voice. He calls them by name, and he leads them out, and the sheep follow because they know his voice. They trust his voice. And it's easy to see perhaps why this particular image is used so often for Jesus. A shepherd guided his sheep to food and to drink, as Jesus does for us. A shepherd kept them together as a community, as Jesus does for us. A shepherd stayed with them always, seeking any that went astray and bringing them back into the fold, and not chastising them and not shaming them, but simply going and bringing them home. He protected them from harsh weather and from other animals who might prey on them. A shepherd slept with them in the sheepfold, always in the presence of his sheep. And a shepherd's singular devotion and responsibility was to his sheep, and the sheep understood that. They listened for and they followed the voice of their shepherd. Even as they sometimes wandered far from him in the fold, they eventually heard his voice. And as I read this story again and again over the past week, and I acknowledged the peacefulness of the image of Jesus as a tender of sheep, I kept going back to the idea of the sheep knowing their shepherd's voice, recognizing it over other voices, which led me to think then about how do I hear and recognize God's voice in my life, in my sheep-like wanderings through this world. And in these moments, or maybe it's been probably hours of cerebral meanderings over the past week, I discovered something about myself that perhaps I already knew, but I couldn't fully articulate until this moment in time. You see, in the midst of these 7 weeks of spending most of my time with silence, living alone, I found that my ability to hear God's voice actually depends on a bit of cacophony, that I actually need some noise. And while many people need the sounds and sights of the world stripped away to hear with their hearts, that's what we're doing when we're listening for God, when we're listening for Jesus speaking to us, we're listening with our hearts, right? I found that it's actually in those sights and sounds that God is most present to me, that I hear God. I read or I hear the 23rd Psalm and think, the idea of being beside still waters and lying down in green pastures does not actually bring me comfort. And it doesn't make me feel closer to God, which seems strange. And honestly, I would think, what in the world is wrong with me? Why is it not that peace that I need? Filtering out the noise and the distractions are the way to open up to God's voice, right? To God's presence. Except they aren't for me. And I have to admit, this troubled me a little bit this week, this kind of sudden realization that I had. Until I started to think back to times in my life when I could so clearly recognize the voice and presence of God, or times when I felt most connected to myself and secure and present to God. And I remember back when I was discerning my call to the priesthood, and then when, after I was ordained, I was discerning what it meant to be a priest for me in my context. And in each of these instances, I first sought someplace quiet and peaceful, retreat centers and walks along peaceful, quiet waters, and I heard crickets. Then I went to Lake Michigan when it was windy, and when the waters were churning and when the waves were crashing. That's what I needed to hear. Not the still glass-like surface, but the roiling, raucous water. And there God was, speaking to me in a way that I could actually hear it. And a couple of years ago, again, when I sought to get away from the noise to try to listen to where God was calling me, I went to a retreat center in the middle of nowhere, Maryland. And I spent 2 days walking in the beautiful meadow and along the lovely stream and felt and heard only silence. So I packed up my bags and I drove into Baltimore. And I spent the next few days walking the streets of that gritty city that I love and hanging out with this group of people who were trying to build this kind of eclectic church built on a response to gun violence in the city of Baltimore. And there God was. And when I look back, I remember I heard God in the sounds in the jails and in the midst of all the people gathered in a homeless camp in Grand Rapids. It wasn't in the silence for me. You see, I realized in thinking about all of these stories and pondering how and where I'm hearing God's voice during this time, that when I think about those sheep, I wouldn't be the sheep that would wander off further into the pasture or deep into the woods. I would have been the sheep that would have wandered off into the city, into the middle of the market where all the people were gathered, right into the thick of it, seeking connection, hearing God's voice in the voices and the actions of God's people. And when I figured that out this week, I have to tell you, it was a little bit freeing. See, the point I'm trying to make, friends, is that we all hear God's voice in our own way. And sometimes we try to fit it into boxes that we think are supposed to be the right way. In the still, small voice, in the quiet pasture, and perhaps for many people, maybe most people, that stillness is where they meet God most profoundly, in the quiet and in the peace away from the sights and sounds of the world. But for others like me, it's a very incarnational experience in order that I might hear God. Hearing and seeing God revealed in the grittiness of the world, in the sights and sounds and smells of people doing their best to navigate a complicated world. It's through their stories that I hear God speaking to me most profoundly and most deeply, recognizing me as a sheep of the fold who needs a different experience and meeting me in that place. I had this experience this past week when I was wrestling with the 23rd Psalm, and I couldn't figure out why in the world I was wrestling with the 23rd Psalm, of all Psalms to wrestle with. You wouldn't think that would be the one, but it is. And as I was wrestling with it throughout the week, I went on a call on Friday, and I'm doing some I'm helping out a nonprofit that I used to work for many years ago. And they're, trying to reorganize, re-engineer to work in this time. What they do, they're in Baltimore, they're based in Baltimore, but they work all over the country. But one of the things they do is they work in houses for low-income families who can't get rid of the lead paint in their house or the hazards in their house that are causing them to be sick. And they go in and they assess the house and they help the family and they fix all the things in the house. Well, they can't do that right now because they can't get into anyone's house. So what they're doing instead is they're going and they're delivering the free breakfasts and lunches that the kids qualify for, but the family doesn't have transportation to go pick up from the distribution center. So these guys who normally go in and take care of paint hazards and fix up houses are going and delivering food instead. And they're calling 500 people that used to get services or who have gotten services from the past and checking in on them and saying, what do you need? Can we bring you some food? Can we bring you some supplies for your house? What can we do for you? And sitting in that moment as these folks, I was at their staff meeting on Friday, and them telling their stories and telling the stories of the people they've been serving who have been saying, thank you. We don't know how we would have done this without you. I thought, oh, there's God. In this secular nonprofit, it's not a faith-based nonprofit, in this secular nonprofit out there in the world doing the work of God. There's God, I thought. That was the voice that I needed to hear. So I hope maybe like me, you're seeking God's voice and thinking about where you do hear God. Where is God present to you during this time? In whatever way makes sense for you. Because God is here in our midst, in our silence and in our sound, in our distance and in our connection. Jesus is always speaking to us, always leading and guiding us, but in a voice that each of us can hear in our own way. And I have found these weeks that freeing myself of the expectation of things being a certain way, like hearing Jesus in a still small voice or in a quiet pasture, instead of in the honking horns that I miss and the sirens and the cacophony of a city, has helped me find a different spirit-filled place within me. And perhaps I needed the extreme contrast of all the noise and now all the silence to discern better how to listen for that voice. So I hope you're finding that time. I hope you're hearing your shepherd's voice, whether he's leading you beside still waters or to the edge of roiling seas, to the solitude of mountains or pastures or to the cacophony of the city streets. Because there's no one single place to hear God. There's no one single way to listen for God's voice. It's wherever each of us go to hear God's voice and where and how we follow. So I pray that we will each listen during this time. Listen for God's voice. And the easiest way to do it is listen for love, because that's the language of God. That is the simple language of God. That's what God sounds like giving food to people in need, like reorganizing the way you do things so that people can still be employed and our neighbors can be helped. Love can be found in every place on earth, and most especially where each of us stand, because that's where God is. So listen to our shepherd, see where he might be leading, and see just how you hear. Amen.
Amen.